Hi everyone, welcome back to this series on pawn formations, and today we'll be looking at a fairly popular one which can be reached from many different positions. It's called the hanging pawn structure, and it resembles something like this with the pawn on c4 and d4, which are on these semi-open files which can easily become weaknesses, but if used correctly can also become a very helpful attacking tool. So in this video we're going to be looking at different ways to play this position from both sides of the board. So by the end of the video you should have a better understanding of how to handle such positions. As always, if you like this particular series or the content, do feel free to leave a like and subscribe down below if you want to see more regular uploads. Leave any comments if you have any feedback. Otherwise I'll jump straight into the video. I hope you guys enjoy it. Okay, so we're going to start things out by looking at how you play with the hanging pawn structure. I've actually picked out two games by two previous world champions, Anatoly Karpov and Garry Kasparov, two players with very different playing styles, just so you can see how you can play these positions differently. So here we had a Queen's Gambit declined by Karpov, and he went for this system with the move pawn to b6. From d4 pawn openings, you'll sort of get these type of pawn structures quite often. So he played knight bd7 here, and then we got some exchange in the center, and then he played the move pawn to c5, and then white exchanged, and he recaptured here with the pawn, and hence we get our pawn structure here in the center of the board. So white continued with the move queen to c2, and in this position black played the move rook c8, just lining up this rook with the queen on c2, which is a very useful idea. And later on you'll see why. After the rook went to d1, black immediately unpins. So this is a useful hint to remember when everyone lines up your rook, their rook with your queen, then it's good to just move it away. And also here it connects the rooks, so we can bring our rook to d8 if we need. So queen to b1, white moves the queen away, we bring the rook across to d8. Here white plays the move rook to c2. Queen to e6 was played here by Karpov, just reshoring this d5 pawn and preparing some pawn advances. So one pawn advance which is very important in this pawn structure is to play the move pawn to d4. Now at some point during the game black will play the move pawn to d4, so he's always looking for this opportunity. Sometimes it will involve playing some tactics to make it work as well. First white played the move bishop to g3. In this position black took some time off to get rid of this important bishop, so he played the move knight to h5, gaining the bishop pair, which is always useful. So here he captures the bishop on g3 and then plays the other knight to f6, just supporting this pawn on d5. So now black has the bishop pair and a slightly more comfortable position here. These two pawns are well defended in the center. As we'll see later, the bishop pair is also very important in these type of pawn structures. So after the move queen to c2, Karpov plays the move g6, just calmly defending against any possible knight jumps from h4 to f5 later on, and also just giving the king a nice square on g7. So a6 is to defend the pawn on a7 after white's queen was attacking it. The king goes to g7, and black is just simply improving his pieces and preparing this pawn thrust in the center. So after the move queen to b6, white played the move pawn to a3 in this position, and now Karpov takes the opportunity to seize the initiative and play the move we've been trying to play for most of the game. And here he does so, justifying it with some tactics, which is usually how black or white gets in this move. So here plays the move pawn to d4. The idea here is that if by chance white takes the pawn, then black's idea is actually to play the move bishop to c6, attacking the queen. And there's actually no good squares for this queen to go to, and it's very difficult to find a square. So for example, if the queen goes back to c2, then he runs into bishop takes f3, and the tactics just don't work out for white in this position. For example, if pawn takes here, then we take on d4 square, and we see that white is losing a piece here because this knight is pinned and there's no way to defend against the capture next move. If instead white tries to throw in some tricks here with bishop pawn takes on c5, then we have bishop takes on d1, also a counter move attacking the queen and also winning the rook as well. So tactics are not in white's favor at all. If he goes queen c4, again we have the move pawn takes d4 and all sorts of discovered attacks here. For example, knight takes d4 is met by the nice bishop to f3 with a discovered attack here on the queen and picking up the rook as well. If instead, let's say white tries pawn takes c5 in this particular position, then again we can just take the queen and then we have bishop takes rook at the end. So nothing seems to work for white after the move bishop to c6. So that's why in this position Korchnoi, who was playing white, opted for the move knight to e2. But after knight to e2, black can simply take on e3, and it's a great trade for black because not only has he gotten rid of this d pawn and really damaged white's pawn structure, but we'll see that the bishop pair will also be very, very helpful later on. So after move pawn to c4, the queen opens up and the bishop's going to come out to c5 at some point. Knight d4 was played. We have the move queen to c7, attacking the g3 pawn. Knight to h4 was played. Now you have to be very careful that you don't capture the pawn on g3 in this position, because that would be a horrible blunder, losing your queen to knight to f5. So this is definitely not what Karpov did. Instead, he played the move queen to e5, a very calm move, just attacking this pawn with check and defending against knight to f5. The king went across, so you still can't take these pawns on e3 or g3. So in this position, black plays the move king to g8. Very calm move, just getting the king out of the way of knight f5 threats. Okay, knight to d3 was played. Now the pawn is hanging, so you can go queen takes g3 in this position. And everything in black's position is just well defended, and the bishops are very strong in this situation. So bishop takes d8 was played. Queen went across. We have the move bishop to e4. Now black starts to trade off some pieces. So after knight takes e4, rook d4 was played, and we have the move knight to f2 check. King went across, and here it's just a matter of black trying to consolidate this position. So knight to d3, the queen went across. We have rook to b8. Now the rook is entering the game on b2 at some point perhaps. So bishop went to c7. And then rook comes in on b2 square. Now white sacrifices the exchange because it's becoming a bit too much to defend this position. And Karpov converts the rest of the game quite nicely. So you see a very calm, meticulous way of playing this particular position by black in this game. And eventually getting this d4 pawn push in. So let's look at the next example. So this one is Kasparov with white. So this is a very famous game. Portage playing the black side in this position. Here he just played the move knight to a5, attacking this pawn on c4, but Kasparov actually gets in our move anyway using some tactics, and you'll see why in hanging pawn positions it's actually very helpful to have the bishop pair, because the bishop pair along this diagonal can be very, very dangerous for your opponent, especially with this idea of a double bishop sacrifice, which we will see later on in this particular game. So in this position, instead of just playing rook c1, which would be the obvious move to defend the pawn on c4, what Kasparov does instead is play the move pawn to d5 anyway, just ignoring the fact that the pawn on c4 is being attacked and using some tactics to generate some sort of counter-attacking chances here for white. So for example, after the move, let's say knight takes c4, white's idea here is very interesting. He wants to go queen to e4, attacking h7, threatening checkmate. Here after g6, he wants to go bishop takes on c4, queen takes, queen e5, again threatening checkmate, f6, and then queen takes e6. And we see that this passed pawn on d5 is again defended in this situation, and it's going to be a very important factor for the rest of this game. So in this instance, black can't play the move rook f7 because of tactical reasons. Here you can play the move rook to c1, and this just wins on the spot because we're picking up the rook on c8. And otherwise black is losing the bishop next move. So we see some tactical justification here. So in the game, instead what happened was black took and then white takes, and here black can take on d5, but the problem is he has to give up his h7 pawn, which is protecting his king. So in a sense it's a very good trade for white, trading the h7 pawn for the d5 pawn, and we get rid of this pawn in the process. So rook takes d5. The rook is also ready to lift for an attack on the king side. So the king went back, and then we had the move bishop takes g7, a very strong double piece sacrifice here. But this is a very common idea you should remember in these hanging pawn positions. Here the idea is that after black takes it, Kasparov actually plays a quiet move. He goes knight to e5, and black just has no pawns at all protecting the king along these files anymore. They're just completely gone, and the king is very vulnerable. Now the idea is to go queen g4 check next, and there's ideas of rook to d7, knight to d7. So there's a lot of dangerous ideas. If the king ever goes here, the rook can always shift across to the h file as well at some point. So black continued rook to d8, and we have to move queen to g4, king to f8, and then Kasparov played the move queen to f5, attacking this pawn, provoking some more weaknesses. So this is a nice counter-attacking move, leaving the rook on pre. So black played the move f6, creating more holes in the position. So now we have the move knight to d7, and because there's so many weaknesses here, black decides to give up the rook in order to stop all these threats by white. So after takes, normally the two pieces would be very strong against the rook, but in this instance white just has too much piece activity, and the king is just too weak here on f8 to do anything about it. So the game finished off quite nicely. So we had check, and then had a nice king hunt here. So the rook comes back. White is threatening to push the h pawn, maybe to swing the rook to g3 and get some mating threats this way. So we have doubling of the rooks, queen h7 check continued, queen check, and the king started marching up the board, and then Kasparov played the move pawn to g4 in this position. Now if knight takes g4, I think there's rook to f3, and then this knight is going to be lost on the next move. So that's why the king continued marching up the board, but then after this check the king just came up a bit too far. So we have to move queen to b3 check, and here black decided to resign, because if the king moves forward any further, then we have to move queen to e3 checkmate. So we saw a very nice game by Kasparov in this instance, and it all started with this idea of pushing the pawn up to d5. So this is a very common plan, and we see that most of the time when you're playing with the pawns, we're trying to get some sort of kingside initiative, or you're trying to create some passed pawn in the center. So next we'll have a look at what to do when you're playing on the opposite end of these type of positions. Okay, so on the opposite end, here we have a position which I've played a number of times myself. This type of pawn structure is where you give up the bishop pair and then try to play against these pawns. Generally, the idea here is to try and get them to push the pawns in a very favorable way for you, where you get some sort of blockade going, and they're unable to really get this d5 pawn push in to create any passed pawn at all, or to get any attacking chances on the king side. So this is generally the idea when you're playing against it. Or you can try to neutralize the bishop pair and also trade off pieces. So trading off pieces generally will help you in a lot of instances. So one idea I often play in these situations is knight h5, going for knight to f4 to try and neutralize some of white's pieces. Sometimes if they go g3 in these positions, I can even bring the knight back to f6 and just say that white's created a lot of weaknesses with the move pawn to g3 and play on from there. In this instance though, Karpov with the black pieces this time played the move bishop takes f3. So giving up both bishops in this instance, but he wanted to play the move pawn to e5, which essentially breaks up white's pawns in the center, because now he's forced to either take, leaving himself with a weak isolated c pawn, or he has to maybe push the pawn, which for instance is met by, let's say, pawn to e4 is a move here for black. And if bishop takes, you could go knight to e4, maybe take on c4. You could also maybe consider playing knight c5 in this position, and then followed by e4. So you have some squares now for your pieces to play with. There are the two bishops that you have to deal with here, but the knights have plenty of good squares here to play around as well. So black is doing okay. In the game, white decided to play the move queen to g3, allowing the move pawn takes d4, trying to get some sort of initiative on the king side with the bishops. So we had the move rook takes e8, well, the knight has to capture here, and then bishop went to f4 to try and keep the queens on the board. But the problem is white never really managed to get enough strong threats on the king side, and black consolidated fairly easily and then managed to have this extra passed pawn in the center, which would eventually determine the rest of the game. So white did have a little bit of pressure here, but yeah, black defended very well and has this passed d pawn at the end of it all. And Karpov went on to convert very nicely here, just grabbing all the pawns and pushing white back slowly. So you see, this is one idea, just creating some unfavorable situation where your opponent has to sort of push their pawns maybe earlier than they would have liked. Let's have a look at the next game. So this one is one with Korchnoi playing the white pieces, and we get a very typical sort of Queen's Gambit type of position here. Again, b6 was played. This time white took here on f6, got this position. And after c5, again, we get our hanging pawn structure. But notice this hanging pawn structure is already a little bit more favorable for white, because one, black is missing the dark squared bishop, so he has a fewer pieces on the board compared to the previous positions. And he's also forced to, trade off his dark squared bishop right away in that instance. So these pawns are a little bit weaker and can be a little bit more of a target for white. So as white here, what you want to do is just attack these pawns from behind and essentially just keep your pieces from a distance here. You don't want to provoke d4 too much, because this is one of black's main ideas, as we saw. So b3, useful move. Queen e6 was played. We have the move rook to d1. We have the move queen to b6, and here white plays a very useful move, just rerouting one of his pieces to attack these pawns. As I said, we want to put as much pressure on these pawns as we possibly can. And here white plays the move knight to e1, so just preparing bishop to f3 to attack this pawn, maybe doubling rooks, and maybe bringing this knight to d3, possibly to put pressure on this pawn, or possibly to play the move knight to f4 to put more pressure on the d5 pawn. So these are all ideas here white is setting up with the move knight to e1. So rook c8 was played. We have the move bishop to g4. Okay, this also puts pressure on this pawn by indirectly attacking the knight and pinning the knight. So we have the move queen g6, bishop to h3, just keeping that pin alive. Rook c7 was played, and in this position white played the move knight to c5. So we see black is under tremendous pressure here. He doesn't really want to push these pawns too early. As I said, if he immediately just goes for the move pawn here, then he might be met by knight to f4, and then this pawn's going to get blockaded later on. I mean, I'm going to put a queen on d4, and okay, this passed pawn is not going anywhere at the moment. Not to mention I have a lot of other moves in this position I can probably play as well. Maybe bishop takes, and some knight e5 later on is a possibility as well, or queen a5. So white has a lot of moves here. Okay, so if knight f6, which is what was played in the game, white played the move queen a5, so attacking the rook, attacking this pawn on c5 square. Knight e8 was played, and then white played rook takes c5, and black decided to resign his position because there's no threats. Like d4 doesn't create any threats because this bishop is already defending this square, so there's no threats in this position here for black. And he just has a weak isolated pawn. He's going to probably lose one of these pawns later on in the game as well. So he decided to just throw in the towel, although it's a bit early, I would say. So you can see that once the pieces started trading off and we started just putting pressure on these pawns, it was very hard for black to defend this type of position. So I hope you guys picked up a few things from this video. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, do feel free to leave a comment down below and I will get to it. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this one and I will see you on the next one. Take care.